new Foreign Secretary says the European Union needs to change tactics or there's a risk the UK will leave the EU without a deal. He's speaking on his first overseas trip since taking over from Boris Johnson, when Jeremy Hunt said a hard Brexit would hurt the British economy and the UK public will blame Brussels for the damage.
So without a real change in approach from the EU negotiators, we do now face a real risk of no deal by accident. And that would be incredibly challenging economically. But my real concern is that it would change British public attitudes to Europe for a generation.
Few areas would feel the effects of a hard Brexit, as it's known, more than Britain's industrial heartland, where decades of decline have already pushed many of its once thriving businesses to the edge of extinction. Steelmakers, though, are finding themselves uniquely caught between a trade war with the US and Brexit uncertainty in Europe. CNN's Anna Stewart has sent us this report from Western England.
Heated, crushed and moulded. This is high-grade steel, and it's heading to the United States and the EU. Peter Davies owns 4 steelworks, employing around 200 people.
Steel is the basic commodity that drives the West Midlands.
Once the beating heart of industrial Britain, now this region is caught between a rock and a hard place: Brexit and US tariffs. The uncertainty putting hundreds of thousands of dollars in new investment on hold.
For the first time, I think, in my life, I'm genuinely worried. If you're a multinational or you've got billions in the bank, then it's fine. You can ride all these things. But we haven't. We live day to day.
The steel he sells to America is highly specialized, used in railroads and mining equipment. It's not subject to tariffs yet, but he worries his factories could become collateral damage in President Trump's trade war.
This is an email from one of our major American customers asking what the impact will be on the steel tariffs.
Davey says the two sides should negotiate instead of retaliating further.
They are literally like kids. You know, I'm going to slap this and I've taken your ball, you can have my bat. The problem is that this is real people, real jobs.
For many of the workers here, it's the only job they've ever known. They sympathise with tariffs that protect local industry. Cheap steel from China and automation have forced hundreds of small factories to close in recent years. Many voted for Brexit for the same reason. Andrew Rich, the operations director, is one of them.
When I look around me, the conditions we live in are getting worse.
But are you worried now that leaving the EU could be quite damaging for this industry and potentially your job?
Yes, I am. I'm not sure what's going to happen after Brexit, but whatever happens, we need some certainty.
And yet he says he wouldn't change his vote.
A lot of them are sort of sanguine, it'll be all right. They don't roll over in the middle of the night thinking, oh my God, where am I going?
That's your job.
That's my job. That's my job. You know, I'm paid to worry.
His companies source raw steel from Germany, and if the UK crashes out of the EU without a deal, his costs could spike.
What would that mean for your business?
It could mean closure. We would probably lose up to 50 or 60% of our market, and that would be devastating.
Until then, the workers here can only hope that politicians keep hammering away at a deal. Anna Stewart, CNN, West Bromwich, UK.
Now, of course, nothing to do with the west of England is in the Midlands, as I got said. The head of UK Steel for the EEF Industry Group says job losses from this combination of trade tariffs and then Brexit uncertainty could make the industry unsustainable. Speaking to Brianna earlier, Gareth Stace said steelmakers are already seeing the effects on their balance sheets and it could get a whole lot worse.
Well, what we've seen with the 25% tariff tax slapped on all of our steel is that we've seen some jobs cancelled in terms of orders that were on the water. We've also seen some American customers of the UK steel sector where they've just had to pay that tariff. But this is the short-term reaction. But the longer-term reaction is going to be that we're going to see a damage to this market for us, which is our second biggest export market after the EU. It's some $500 million worth in 2017. So anything that puts that at risk is going to have a significant impact on our sector.
Yeah, 10% of your steel is actually sent to the U.S. You mentioned having 25 million tons of steel needing to find a new home. What is being done now to avoid a glut of steel in the UK, as we have seen just a couple of years ago?
Well, as soon as we knew that President Trump was going to slap this tax on our steel, we looked to the European Commission in Brussels to take swift, firm and effective action. And what they've done, and we'll see that come in later this week, is what's called safeguard measures. And that actually limits the amount of steel that can come in globally onto the onto the EU market, and that will limit that surge, that anticipated surge of steel that won't now go to the US market, that needs to find a new home to go to. So we're very pleased that the European Commission has taken that swift action, because if it didn't, we'd have a double whammy. Not only do we have a tax slapped on our steel that goes to the US, but we'd also see our market just flooded with steel, the price would go down, and we would find that there were jobs at risk in our sector in the UK, like we saw in 2015, 2016, which was the worst steel crisis in the UK steel sector in well over a generation.
And there's real consequences, obviously, first and foremost, jobs. Talk about the number of jobs in the UK alone that are dependent on this production, and if in fact you do go back to the 2016 levels, the crisis that you'd seen there, what kind of impact will that have not only on jobs but the economy as a whole?
Well, in 2015, 2016, we lost 5,000 to 6,000 jobs in our sector. Let me put that into context. We employ currently today about 31,000 people directly in the steel sector, and you multiply that by 4 or 5 times in terms of indirect jobs. So we lost a significant proportion. You know, if we were to lose the similar proportion, we would then potentially become an unsustainable sector in the UK, and that could lead to severe problems, and we don't want to go there, because actually, you know, the future really for the steel sector in the UK, in Europe, and actually globally, should have a brighter future than we see at the moment.
Tell me, what is a bigger concern right now? The 25% steel tariffs coming in from your number 2 export, being the U.S., or Brexit negotiations?
Well, I think the tariffs, the 25% tariff, it's an immediate and short-term concern. You know, I'd like to think we can find some resolution there. I was hoping that when President Trump came over to London and Scotland last weekend, that he would bring a gift with him, and that gift would be that he would exempt the UK from the tariffs. That didn't happen. But the Brexit concern is such an unknown. It's unprecedented, as you said before. We've never seen it in the last 40 years. We don't know what it's like to be out of Europe, and therefore it's just totally unknown territory, and that's why it's very concerning for all businesses, let alone the steel sector, because we thrive on free trade in the global steel sector, and if we limited that in any way in the UK, we'd have problems going forward.